June 6, 1944. 7:45 in the morning. The cold ocean spray hit the faces of 14,000 Canadian soldiers as their landing craft bobbed in 10-foot waves. Through the thick fog and smoke, they could see it, the gray concrete bunkers of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. German machine guns were already firing. Tracer bullets lit up the morning sky like deadly fireflies. The Canadians were about to hit the most heavily defended beach of the entire D-Day invasion. 5 miles to the west, General William Foster stood on the deck of the USS Augusta, his command ship with binoculars pressed to his eyes. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from what he was watching. At Omaha Beach, the American sector, his boys were still pinned down at the waterline, bodies floating in the surf, medics screaming, blood turning the ocean red. The sounds carried across the water, the crack of rifles, the thunder of artillery, the screaming. But when Foster swung his binoculars east toward the Canadian sector at Juno Beach, he saw something that made no sense, something that violated every principle of amphibious warfare he'd learned in 30 years of military service. The Canadians were not huddled behind beach obstacles. They were not pinned down. They were moving, fast, wave after wave of landing craft hitting the sand in rapid succession. 30 seconds apart, maybe less. Foster lowered his binoculars slowly. His aide, Colonel James Rudder, stood beside him, also watching through field glasses. Colonel Rudder, Foster said quietly, "How long between landing waves in our sector?" 3 minutes, sir. Standard doctrine. Foster nodded. He raised his binoculars again. And the Canadians? Rudder checked his watch, timing the landing craft. "Sir, they're coming in every 30 seconds. Maybe less. They're flooding the beach." Foster watched in silence. Every military textbook said this was wrong. You space your landing waves 3 minutes apart. You give each wave time to establish defensive positions before sending the next. You minimize K, you maintain order. That was the doctrine. That was what every military academy in the world taught. The Canadians were doing the opposite, and somehow impossibly it was working. Foster watched Canadian soldiers sprint across the beach, not walking, not advancing carefully, sprinting, like men possessed. Behind them, specialized tanks rolled onto the sand, mine-clearing tanks with rotating drums, flamethrower tanks shooting streams of fire into German bunkers, regular tanks providing covering fire. And behind the tanks, more infantry, more waves, more men, a continuous flood of soldiers in armor pouring onto Juno Beach faster than the Germans could respond. "Maybe we've been doing this wrong," Foster said. The words came out before he could stop them. Rudder turned to look at him. Sir Foster didn't answer. He just kept watching the Canadians do something that should have been impossible. But to understand what Foster was seeing, to understand why it mattered, we need to go back. 2 years earlier, to another beach, to a disaster so complete, so devastating, that it convinced one Canadian general that everything the military establishment believed about amphibious warfare was backwards. That general's name was James Thornton, and what he learned from watching men die would save thousands of lives on D-Day. It would force the American military to rewrite its training manuals, and it would prove that sometimes the most dangerous people to underestimate are the ones nobody expects to be brilliant. This is the story of how Canada taught America to win wars. August 19th, 1942, Dieppe, France. 2 years before D-Day. The Pebble Beach was covered in bodies, Canadian bodies. The water was red, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of death. Private Tommy Sullivan, 20 years old from Saskatchewan, lay behind a destroyed tank trying to breathe, trying not to die. His M19 machine gun was jammed with sand and blood. Around him, men were screaming, some for medics, some for their mothers, some just screaming. 50 yards to Tommy's left, his older brother Michael was dying. Tommy had watched it happen, had watched the German machine gun bullets tear through Michael's chest, had watched his brother go down. But Tommy couldn't reach him. Every time Tommy moved, German fire forced him back down. So he stayed there behind the tank, listening to his brother die. The plan had been simple. 6,000 Canadian soldiers would land at Dieppe. They would hit German positions, gather intelligence, withdraw before reinforcements arrived. A raid, not an invasion. The Canadian commanders had followed the manual exactly. Standard amphibious assault doctrine. Landing waves spaced 3 minutes apart. Each wave establishes defensive positions before the next arrives. Slow, methodical, careful. The textbook approach. It had been a bloodbath. The first wave hit the beach at 5:20 in the morning. They established positions behind beach obstacles just like the manual said. 3 minutes later, the second wave arrived. They joined the first wave. Consolidated. 3 minutes after that, the third wave. Then the fourth. Bruh. Each wave adding to the groups of men huddled behind inadequate cover while German machine guns fired from concrete bunkers on the cliffs above. The Germans had perfect firing angles. They could focus their fire on each group of Canadians, picking them apart. When the Canadians tried to advance, they were cut down. When they stayed in position, they were cut down. There was nowhere to go, no way forward, no way back, just the beach and the bullets and the dying. By 9 in the morning, 4 hours after the first landing, the raid was over. 68% casualties. More than 2,000 Canadian soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in just 9 hours. Some units lost 90% of their men. Bodies stacked on the pebbles like cordwood. Tommy Sullivan made it off the beach. Somehow. A miracle or luck, or maybe just because death was busy that day with other men. But Michael didn't make it. Michael died on those stones, blood pouring from his chest, while Tommy watched from 50 yards away. Tommy was evacuated to a hospital in England. Shell-shocked, traumatized. Physically, he would recover. But mentally, the doctors weren't sure. He barely spoke for the first 3 days, just stared at the wall. When he did speak, it was always the same thing. Michael's last words, the last thing Michael had said before the light went out of his eyes. Don't stop. Next time, keep moving. 1 week after Dieppe, a man walked into Tommy's hospital ward. Colonel James Thornton, 40 years old, unremarkable looking. Average height, thinning hair, round face. Not the kind of man who looked like he'd change warfare. Not the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. But Thornton had been assigned to interview Dieppe survivors, to figure out what went wrong, to write a report that would probably gather dust in some filing cabinet. Thornton sat down beside Tommy's bed. He had a notebook and a pen. No judgment in his eyes, no pity, just questions. Private Sullivan, Thornton said quietly, I'm Colonel Thornton. I'd like to ask you about what happened at Dieppe, if you're willing to talk. Tommy didn't look at him, just kept staring at the wall. My brother died there. I know, Thornton said. I'm sorry. Can you tell me what happened? Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then he started talking. He told Thornton everything, how the first wave had landed, how they'd established defensive positions, how they'd waited for the next wave, how the Germans had picked them apart while they waited, how Michael had been hit during one of those waits, how his squad couldn't reach Michael because they were pinned down, how Michael had bled out on the stones. We stopped, Tommy said. His voice was flat, empty. We followed orders. We established positions. We waited. And while we waited, they killed us. Michael told me before he died, don't stop, keep moving. Thornton wrote that down. He spent 40 minutes with Tommy, asked detailed questions about timing, about German positions, about when casualties were highest. Then he thanked Tommy and moved to the next bed, the next survivor. The next story. Over the following weeks, Thornton interviewed 47 Dieppe survivors. He studied casualty statistics. He mapped German firing positions. He timed each phase of the assault. He filled 3 notebooks with observations and calculations. His wife, Margaret, started to worry about him. He would stay up until 2, 3 in the morning, surrounded by papers, calculating, measuring, analyzing. Jim, she would say, finding him at his desk in the middle of the night. You're obsessing again. Thornton would look up with tired, haunted eyes. 2,000 men died because we followed the textbook, Margaret. I need to understand why. What Thornton was discovering went against everything he'd been taught, everything every military academy in the world taught. The conventional wisdom was clear. When attacking a fortified beach, you moved slowly. You gave each wave time to establish positions. You were cautious. You were careful. You minimize chaos. That's what the manual said. That's what the experts taught. At Dieppe, following those rules had led to disaster. But Thornton was starting to realize something radical, something that would end his career if he said it out loud. Dieppe didn't fail because the Canadians were too aggressive. It failed because they weren't aggressive enough. They had followed the slow, methodical approach. They had paused. They had tried to consolidate. And while they paused, the Germans had cut them to pieces. The kill zone on a beach is not a place to be careful, Thornton wrote in his notebook one night. It is a place to run through as fast as possible. He spent months on his analysis, months his superiors thought he was wasting. They wanted a simple report, a summary, lessons learned, move on. But Thornton couldn't move on because he'd figured out something crucial. The most dangerous place in a beach assault is not the waterline. It's not the beach itself. It's the zone between the waterline and the enemy fortifications. That zone is where the Germans have perfect firing angles. That zone is where soldiers are most exposed. And the longer you stay in that zone, the more men you lose. His conclusion was radical. Instead of 3-minute intervals between waves, he wanted 30-second intervals. Instead of letting troops bunch up and consolidate, he wanted them to keep moving forward. Instead of caution, he wanted speed. Instead of following doctrine, he wanted momentum. Winter 1943, Thornton was promoted to Major General, given command of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, and he started training them to do something no other military unit was doing, training them to hit a beach fast, to flood the killing zone so quickly the enemy couldn't focus fire, to never stop, never pause, just keep pushing forward. His soldiers thought he was crazy at first. Everything they had been taught said you take cover, you consolidate, you wait for support. But Thornton drilled them relentlessly. 30-second spacing, continuous movement, run through the danger, don't walk. Every instinct would tell them to stop to take cover. He needed them to ignore those instincts. He needed them to trust the math. Because Thornton had done the math, he'd calculated rate of casualty equals time and kill zone times enemy fire concentration. The faster you move through that zone, the less time the enemy had to target you. The more men you put in that zone simultaneously, the harder it was for the enemy to focus on any single group. It was counterintuitive, but the numbers didn't lie. March 1944, Allied Headquarters, London. Thornton presented his plan to a room full of American and British officers. Maps spread across a large table, statistics on a chalkboard. Thornton standing at the front of the room and explaining his theory, his vision, his radical new approach. The response was immediate resistance. An American colonel named Davis stood up. General Thornton, this violates every principle of amphibious doctrine. You'll create chaos on the beach. Your formations will break down. It will be worse than Dieppe, a British brigadier named Hampton nodded. The Dieppe disaster proved we need more caution, not less, more planning, more control. What you're proposing is madness. Thornton looked at them. These were men with more experience than him, more prestige, officers from famous military families, West Point graduates, Sandhurst men. And here was James Thornton, nobody from nowhere telling them they were wrong. Dieppe failed because of caution, Thornton said. Every minute we paused, more men died. I've run the calculations 50 times. Speed saves lives. Hesitation kills. The room erupted in argument. American officers saying it would never work. British officers citing military theory. Someone mentioned that the Canadians lacked real combat experience compared to American and British forces. Someone else suggested that Thornton was traumatized by Dieppe and couldn't think clearly. The word reckless was used multiple times. General William Foster was in that room. He listened to Thornton's presentation, looked at the numbers, and shook his head. The Canadians are going to get themselves killed, Foster said to his aide afterward. Following textbook doctrine, it is how you win battles, not by charging ahead like madmen. Thornton almost lost his command that day. There were discussions about replacing him with someone safer, someone who would follow established procedures. But Thornton had one crucial supporter, Admiral Robert Harris, head of the Royal Canadian Navy. Harris had also studied Dieppe independently, had reached the same conclusions. And Harris had something Thornton didn't have: political connections, influence, the ability to make phone calls to people who made decisions. In a closed-door meeting, Harris put his career on the line. I've seen the analysis, Harris told Canadian High Command. Thornton is right. Conventional wisdom killed 2,000 men at Dieppe. If we don't let him try this, we'll kill 2,000 more. Later, Harris met with Thornton privately. Jim Harris said, I'm betting my career on you. Everything I've built for 30 years. Don't prove me wrong. The compromise was this. Thornton could train his division using the new tactics, but American units would not adopt them. British units would wait and see. Only the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division would use Thornton's method when they hit Juno Beach. If it worked, others might follow. If it failed, Thornton would be removed from command, possibly court-martialed, and Canada's military reputation would be destroyed. The pressure was immense. December 1943 through May 1944. 6 months of intensive training. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division practiced Thornton's doctrine every single day, on beaches in Scotland that resembled Normandy, on assault courses designed to simulate German defenses. They practiced 30-second spacing. They practiced continuous movement forward. They practiced ignoring the instinct to stop and take cover. Among those training was Private Tommy Sullivan. He'd volunteered to return to combat, to be part of Thornton's division, because of what Michael had said. Keep moving. Tommy wanted to prove his brother right, wanted to do better next time. Tommy met a sergeant during training, Frank Morrison, 28 years old, former high school math teacher from Ontario, now a combat engineer specializing in demolitions. Frank had also been at Dieppe, had also lost men there. He and Tommy became friends, 2 survivors trying to make sense of what they'd been through, trying to prepare for what was coming. One evening, sitting on the beach after a training exercise, Frank said to Tommy, "This new way of fighting, it feels wrong. Every instinct says stop and take cover." Tommy stared at the ocean, the waves rolling in, peaceful now. But soon those waves would be carrying them toward another beach, another battle. Instinct got my brother killed, Sarge. At Dieppe, we stopped. We followed the manual. Michael bled out while we waited for the next wave. This time, I'm keeping my promise to him. I'm not stopping. Frank nodded slowly. I lost 12 men at Dieppe. Good men. They died because we were too careful, because we did what we were told. Maybe Thornton's right. Maybe we need to do the opposite. Another soldier training with them was Corporal Jack Bennett, 24 years old from British Columbia, tank commander. Jack would be operating a Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tank. He spent his evenings maintaining the equipment, checking the flame fuel, testing the firing mechanism. His hands shook sometimes, not from fear of combat, from fear of failure, of letting his crew down, of proving the doubters right. Jack understood what was at stake. If the Canadian assault failed, if Thornton's tactics led to massive casualties, the American and British commanders would say, "We told you so." They'd say the Canadians had been reckless, naive, that colonial troops didn't understand modern warfare. The humiliation would be worse than the casualties. On the command ship USS Hillary, radio operator Eddie Chen was also preparing, 22 years old Chinese-Canadian from Vancouver. Eddie spoke 3 languages, English, Cantonese, and French. That last one would be crucial if they actually made it off the beach, if they actually liberated French towns. He would be the bridge between Canadian soldiers and French civilians. But first they had to survive. June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day. 14,000 Canadian soldiers loaded into landing craft at ports across southern England. The weather was terrible. Rain, wind, whiffs already 10 feet high. Some men were seasick before they even left port. They knew where they were going now, Juno Beach. The intelligence briefings had been detailed. 21,000 German defenders, 8-foot-thick concrete bunkers, 88mm anti-tank guns, mines everywhere. Barbed wire, machine gun nests covering every inch of sand. The Germans called their defenses the Atlantic Wall. Hitler had boasted it was impregnable. Tommy Sullivan sat in his landing craft that night, unable to sleep. The craft rocked in the waves. Men around him vomited, prayed, wrote letters home. Tommy pulled out a piece of paper and wrote by flashlight, "Ma, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. Tell Michael I tried to do better this time. Tell him I didn't stop. Tell him I kept my promise. I love you, Tommy." He folded the letter, put it in his jacket, hoped he'd be able to tear it up tomorrow, hoped he'd survive to write a different letter, one that said, "I made it. Across the flotilla, Jack Bennett was in his tank checking systems for the 100th time. The flamethrower mechanism, the tracks, the engine, the radio, everything had to work perfectly tomorrow. One malfunction could mean death for him and his crew. His hands were shaking again. He gripped the controls tighter, trying to steady himself. Frank Morrison sat with a group of engineers going over their demolition plans. They'd be responsible for clearing paths through German obstacles, blowing up barbed wire with Bangalore torpedoes, marking safe lanes with white tape. It was dangerous work, the kind of work where one mistake meant you died and took several friends with you. Frank tried not to think about that, tried to focus on the technical details, the timing, the procedures. Eddie Chen was on the command ship testing radio equipment, making sure all frequencies were clear, all channels working. Communication would be crucial tomorrow. If they couldn't coordinate between units, between beach and ship, between infantry and tanks, the whole operation could fall apart. Eddie had lists of code words, call signs, frequency numbers. He'd memorized them all. But he kept checking anyway, double-checking, triple-checking. On that same command ship, General James Thornton stood at the railing, looking out at the dark ocean. He couldn't sleep. Tomorrow would prove whether he was a genius or a fool, whether his theory would save lives or kill thousands. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical thing. 14,000 men trusting him, following his plan, a plan that everyone else said was wrong. Admiral Harris found Thornton there, standing alone in the dark. "Can't sleep?" Harris asked. Thornton shook his head. "If I'm wrong, Robert, if the theory doesn't work in practice, those men die because of me." Harris stood beside him, silent for a moment. Then he said, "You're not wrong, Jim. The math is sound. The logic is clear. Tomorrow you'll prove it." Thornton wanted to believe that, wanted to have Harris's confidence. But he kept thinking about Tommy Sullivan, about Frank Morrison, about Jack Bennett and Eddie Chen and all the others, about the weight of 14,000 lives resting on equations in a notebook, on a theory developed by analyzing a disaster, on the radical idea that running toward danger was safer than hiding from it. The ocean was dark, the waves were high, and dawn was coming. In 12 hours, James Thornton would know if he'd discovered a better way to win wars, or if he'd just sent 14,000 men to die proving the conventional wisdom right. In 12 hours, the beaches of Normandy would run red with blood, and history would record whether June 6, 1944 was a triumph or another Dieppe. The landing craft engines rumbled in the darkness. 14,000 men waited, and the night slowly gave way to a gray, terrible dawn. 7:55 in the morning, June 6, 1944. The landing craft carrying Private Tommy Sullivan hit the sand of Juno Beach with a grinding crunch. The impact threw men forward. Equipment clanged. Someone shouted, then the ramp dropped and hell opened up. German machine gun fire tore through the air. The sound was overwhelming. Not like in the movies, not dramatic single shots, but a continuous roar, like fabric tearing, like the world screaming. Tracer rounds streaked past in lines of fire. Explosions threw up geysers of sand and water. The noise was so loud, it became physical. A pressure in the chest, a weight in the skull. Tommy didn't think, couldn't think. His body moved before his brain caught up. 60 pounds of equipment on his back. M19 machine gun in his hands. Cold seawater up to his waist. And somewhere in his head, Michael's voice. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Keep moving." Men were falling. Tommy saw it in his peripheral vision. Bodies hitting the water, red spreading in the surf. But he couldn't stop. Couldn't help them. Could only run. His legs pumping. His lungs burning. Salt spray in his face. The sand soft under his boots. Every step felt like running through mud. Like the beach was trying to hold him back. Trying to keep him in the killing zone. A bullet passed so close to Tommy's head he felt the heat. Another hit the sand at his feet, but he kept running. Past the waterline, past the first line of obstacles. Tank traps and wooden stakes and coils of barbed wire. The engineers were supposed to clear paths, but Tommy couldn't see any paths. Could only see smoke and chaos and men running and dying. He dove behind a concrete obstacle, a chunk of the Atlantic wall. His chest heaving, his hands shaking. He'd made it maybe 50 yards. Not far enough. Not nearly far enough. but he was alive. For now, 30 seconds. That's how long Tommy had been on the beach when the second wave hit. He could hear it over the gunfire, the roar of more landing craft engines, the crash of ramps dropping, more men pouring onto the sand. Not 3 minutes later, like at Dieppe, 30 seconds. Just like Thornton had planned, Sergeant Frank Morrison was in that second wave, 28 years old. Combat engineer, expert at demolitions. Frank's landing craft hit the beach and he was moving before the ramp fully dropped. He had Bangalore torpedoes strapped to his back, satchel charges on his belt. His job was to blow paths through German obstacles, to clear the way for the men behind him. Frank saw Tommy behind the concrete obstacle, recognized him somehow despite the chaos. He ran toward that position. Not in a straight line, zigzagging, dodging. Other engineers were with him, 5 men carrying explosives, running toward death with bombs on their backs. A mortar round landed 10 feet from Frank. The explosion knocked him sideways. His ears rang, but he kept moving, reached Tommy's position, dove behind the same concrete wall. Sullivan Frank shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "You hit." Tommy shook his head. "Just scared out of my mind, Sarge." Frank allowed himself a brief smile. "Good. That means you're sane. Now help me clear this wire." They worked together. Frank set Bangalore torpedoes against coils of barbed wire, long tubes filled with explosives. Tommy provided covering fire with his machine gun. Not aimed fire, just suppressing. Trying to keep German heads down. Trying to buy Frank the seconds he needed. The Bangalore exploded, a massive boom that Frank felt in his bones. The barbed wire disintegrated, fragments of metal flying in every direction. When the smoke cleared, there was a path. Not a big path, but enough. Frank marked it with white tape. Engineers were supposed to mark cleared paths so following waves would know where to go. Simple system. White tape means safe, or at least safer. No tape means mines and wire and death. "Go!" Frank shouted to Tommy. "Keep moving." "Don't stop here." Tommy wanted to argue, wanted to stay behind cover. Every instinct said hunker down. Wait for support. Let someone else go first. But he remembered Michael. Remembered Dieppe. Remembered men dying because they stopped. So he ran. Through the path Frank had cleared. Toward the German fortifications. Toward the concrete bunkers and machine gun nests that were still firing. Other men followed Tommy, using the path, following the white tape, the continuous stream of soldiers that Thornton had envisioned. Not isolated groups that Germans could destroy one at a time, but a flood, a river of men flowing inland. On the command ship USS Hillary, General James Thornton stood at the railing with binoculars pressed to his face. His knuckles were white from gripping the railing, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He was counting under his breath. 30, 31, 32, timing the waves. The second wave appeared through the smoke, right on schedule, 30 seconds after the first. Then 30 seconds after that, the third wave. The beach was filling with men, with tanks, with the organized chaos that Thornton had spent 2 years developing. Admiral Robert Harris stood beside him, watching the same scene. Harris had bet his career on this plan, had fought the skeptics, had used every ounce of political capital he possessed to let Thornton try this. Now they would both know if they'd been right or if they'd just sent 14,000 men to die. Eddie Chen, the radio operator, was at his station below deck. 22 years old, Chinese-Canadian, fluent in 3 languages. Eddie's job was to monitor all radio channels, to track the progress of each unit, to relay information to Thornton. He had a map spread in front of him, colored pins showing where different units were. Red for Regina Rifles, blue for Royal Winnipeg Rifles, green for engineers. He moved the pins as reports came in. Sir Eddie called up to the deck. Regina Rifles report they've breached the seawall. They're engaging bunkers on the high ground. Thornton didn't lower his binoculars. Time since landing, 7 minutes, sir. Thornton felt something in his chest, relief maybe, or hope. 7 minutes and they were already off the beach, already attacking German positions. At Dieppe, 7 minutes in the first wave had still been pinned down at the waterline. "Keep them updated," Thornton said. "All units maintain forward pressure. No pausing, no consolidation. Keep moving. 8:02 in the morning. Corporal Jack Bennett's Churchill crocodile tank rolled off the landing craft onto Juno Beach. The impact jolted everyone inside. 4 men in a metal box. Driver, gunner, loader, and Jack as commander. The inside of the tank was already hot, would only get hotter. Diesel fumes and cordite and sweat. Jack looked through his periscope. All he could see was smoke, gray and black and occasionally lit by explosions. The visibility was maybe 20 feet. Maybe. He couldn't see the German bunkers he was supposed to be targeting. Couldn't see much of anything except chaos. Driver Jack said into the intercom, "Follow the mine-clearing tanks. Stay in their tracks. Don't deviate." The tank lurched forward, 40 tons of steel and explosives moving across sand. Ahead of them, Jack could see the flail tanks. Tanks with rotating drums on the front that detonated mines. The drums spun and hit the sand, and mines exploded in controlled detonations, creating safe paths for the tanks behind them. "Target," the gunner said suddenly. "Bunker, 11 o'clock, 800 yards. Jack swung his periscope, saw it. A concrete bunker, German machine gun firing from a slit. Muzzle flashes visible, even through the smoke. That bunker was killing Canadian infantry. Had to be silenced. "Load flame," Jack ordered. The loader worked the mechanism. The Churchill crocodile carried a flamethrower. A terrible weapon, horrific but effective against bunkers. Jack had trained on it for months, had fired it dozens of times in practice. But this was different. This was real. This would kill real men. "Flame ready," the loader reported. "Fire," Jack said. The flamethrower shot a stream of burning fuel, 50 feet, 60 feet, an arc of fire that hit the bunker and poured through the machine gun slit. The effect was immediate. The German machine gun stopped firing. Men stumbled out of the bunker, on fire, screaming, rolling in the sand. Some kept burning, some died quickly, some didn't die at all, just burned. Jack felt sick, but he couldn't stop, couldn't think about the men he was killing. Had to keep moving, had to support the infantry. That was his job. That was what he'd been trained to do. "Target eliminated," the gunner said, his voice flat, emotionless, the voice of a man trying not to feel. "Next target," Jack said. "Keep moving." At 8:15, exactly 20 minutes after the first landing, Eddie Chen received a radio report that made him freeze. He stared at the message, read it again. Couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sir Eddie called to Thornton. "Regina Rifles report, they're 2 miles inland." Thornton spun around. "Say again." "2 miles, sir. They've penetrated 2 miles into France. They report minimal resistance. German defenders retreating." The other officers on the command ship stopped what they were doing. 2 miles, in 20 minutes. That was impossible. At this stage of an amphibious assault, units should barely be off the beach, should be consolidating positions, preparing for counterattacks. Not 2 miles inland. Thornton felt something he hadn't felt in years. Vindication. His theory was working. The math was proving itself in blood and sand and German retreat. Speed through the danger zone was saving lives. Momentum was overwhelming German defenses. But he couldn't celebrate. Not yet. The battle was far from over. "All units," Thornton said into the radio, "maintain pressure. Continue inland. Do not pause. Do not consolidate. The enemy is off balance. Keep them that way." 5 miles to the west on the USS Augusta, General William Foster was watching the Canadian sector through binoculars. He'd been watching for 30 minutes now, watching something that shouldn't be possible, something that violated everything he'd been taught. Foster turned to Colonel James Rudder, his aide, his chief of staff, a man who'd been with him through North Africa and Sicily. "Rudder," Foster said slowly, "how are the Canadians already that far inland?" Rudder had been checking reports, coordinating with naval observers, trying to understand what he was seeing. "Sir, they're not stopping. They just keep coming, wave after wave. The Germans can't focus fire on any single group, can't establish a coherent defense." Foster was quiet for a moment. He thought about the briefings before D-Day, thought about how American commanders had dismissed the Canadian plan, had called it reckless, naive, how they'd predicted disaster. "Maybe we underestimated them," Foster said quietly. Sir Rudder wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "The Canadians," Foster repeated. Maybe we underestimated them. Maybe their general knows something we don't. It was as close as Foster would come to admitting he'd been wrong. That American doctrine might be flawed. That innovation could come from unexpected places. But it was enough. It was the first crack in conventional wisdom. The beginning of a change that would spread through the entire American military. 9 o'clock in the morning, Tommy Sullivan and his squad reached the town of Courseulles-sur-Mer, a small French town, stone buildings, narrow streets, and Germans. Lots of Germans. The 716th Infantry Division had established defensive positions throughout the town. Machine gun nests at intersections, snipers in windows, anti-tank guns covering approach routes. The standard procedure for clearing a fortified town was slow and methodical. Surround it, cut off escape routes, clear it building by building, room by room. Minimize casualties by being cautious. That was the textbook approach. Tommy's corporal, a guy from Toronto named Mackenzie, was looking at the town through binoculars. "We should wait for armor support," Mackenzie said. "Let the tanks soften them up first." Frank Morrison shook his head. "If we wait, they'll dig in deeper. We need to keep moving." Mackenzie looked at Frank like he was crazy. "Sarge, charging through that town is suicide. They'll cut us to pieces." "Stopping is suicide," Frank replied. "Remember Dieppe? Remember what happened when we stopped?" Tommy looked at the town, at the stone buildings, at the smoke rising from German positions. He thought about Michael, about the promise he'd made, about not stopping. "I'm with Sarge," Tommy said. "We go fast. We go now." Mackenzie stared at them. Two men who'd been at Dieppe. Two men who knew what stopping meant. Finally, he nodded. "All right, we go, but if we die, I'm haunting both of you." They heard it then. The rumble of Jack Bennett's tank, the Churchill Crocodile rolling up behind them. Other tanks too, regular Shermans, mine-clearing flails, the armor support they needed. Jack's voice came over the radio. "Flame 3 to infantry, we're coming through. Stay behind us and keep moving. Don't stop for anything." Frank keyed his radio. "Infantry to Flame 3. Roger that. We'll follow your lead." The tanks rolled forward, firing as they moved, high explosive shells slamming into German positions, machine guns raking windows where snipers might be hiding, and behind the tanks, Tommy and the infantry, running, not walking, not advancing tactically, running through the streets of Courseulles like men possessed. German machine gun fire tore through the air. Bullets ricocheted off stone. But the Canadians kept moving. When Germans tried to establish firing positions, tanks destroyed those positions. When Germans retreated to new buildings, Canadians were already on them. The speed was overwhelming, shocking. The Germans had prepared for a methodical assault, for time to adjust, for opportunities to counterattack. They got none of that, just continuous pressure, just Canadians who wouldn't stop. Tommy crashed through a door, weapon up. A German soldier stood there, maybe 19 years old, terrified. Rifle in his hands but not raised, just held at waist level. For one frozen second, they stared at each other. Two young men, both scared, both far from home, both caught in a war they hadn't started. Tommy's finger was on the trigger. He could shoot, should shoot. This was the enemy. This was the man who'd been trying to kill him moments ago. But all Tommy saw was fear, human fear, the same fear he felt. "Rouse," Tommy said, the only German word he knew. "Get out." The German dropped his rifle. Hands up. He ran. Tommy let him go, didn't shoot him in the back, didn't call for him to stop, just watched him disappear around a corner. Later, Tommy would wonder about that German, would wonder if he survived the war, would wonder if he went home to his family, would wonder if he ever thought about the Canadian who'd let him live. By 9:30, Courseulles was captured. The Germans were either dead retreating or surrendering. Canadian flags were going up on buildings. French civilians were emerging from cellars, crying, cheering, offering wine and bread to exhausted soldiers who couldn't quite believe they were still alive. In his bunker 3 miles inland, German Major Klaus Weber was listening to radio reports with growing disbelief. Weber commanded a regiment of the 716th Infantry Division, 800 men, good men, well-trained, well-equipped. They'd been defending this coast for 2 years, knew every inch of it, had prepared for every contingency, except this. except Canadians who wouldn't stop, who wouldn't follow the rules. Sector 7 is overrun, a radio operator reported. Enemy tanks in Courseulles, we can't stop them. They're everywhere. Weber had fought British forces in 1940, had fought Americans in North Africa, had fought Russians on the Eastern Front, but he'd never seen anything like this. The Canadians attacked like men who had nothing to lose, like demons. They wouldn't stand still long enough to be targeted, wouldn't consolidate long enough to be surrounded, just kept pushing forward, always forward. Weber made a decision, one that would shock his superiors, one that might get him court-martialed, but one that would save lives. Prepare a white flag, Weber told his aide. I'm going to offer surrender. The aide stared at him. Sir, we can still fight. We have ammunition. We have defensive positions. We have nothing, Weber said tiredly. They're already past us, already miles inland. We can fight and die for nothing, or we can surrender and live. I choose life. 10 o'clock. German panzer tanks were moving toward Juno Beach. The 21st Panzer Division, Germany's strategic reserve, 140 tanks, Tiger tanks, Panzer IVs, the best armor Germany had in France. Their commander, Colonel Heinrich Richter, was confident. The Canadians had overextended, had pushed too far too fast. Now they would be cut off and destroyed. On the USS Hillary Thornton received the intelligence report. German armor approaching, significant force. Every conventional wisdom said to order a tactical withdrawal, to consolidate, to dig in and prepare for the counterattack. That was what the textbook said. Thornton grabbed the radio microphone. All units, this is Thornton. German armor approaching your positions. Do not attempt to engage unless absolutely necessary. Your objective is distance, not destruction. Keep pushing inland. The panzers can't catch what they can't pin down. Maintain the advance. Admiral Harris looked at him. Jim, you're asking them to run past German tanks, Thornton nodded. The moment we stop moving, we start dying. Speed is our armor. Has been all day. Tommy Sullivan's squad was moving through a forest when they heard it. The unmistakable rumble of heavy armor. Then they saw it. A Tiger tank. Massive. Terrifying. 88mm gun that could destroy anything the Canadians had. The tank was 200 yards away. Turret, swinging, looking for targets. Everyone hit the ground. Tommy's heart was hammering. They couldn't fight that thing. Infantry against a Tiger tank was suicide. Mackenzie was on the radio, calling for anti-tank support. But the nearest tanks were minutes away. They didn't have minutes. Frank grabbed Tommy's arm. We run, perpendicular to its position. It can't track us if we don't stay still. That's insane, Mackenzie said. Staying here is insane, Frank replied. Move or die, those are the options. They ran, not away from the Tiger, not directly, but perpendicular, across its field of fire. The tank's turret swung toward them, the massive gun barrel tracking. Tommy could see it moving, could imagine the shell loading. The gunner lining up the shot. Any second now they would all die. The Tiger fired. The explosion was enormous. But behind them, the gunner had led the target too much. By the time the shell arrived, Tommy and the others were already past that spot, already in different positions. The turret tried to track them, but they were moving too fast, zigzagging. By the time the Tiger could fire again, they were in the tree line. Out of sight, Tommy collapsed against a tree, his legs shaking, his whole body trembling. That was the closest he'd come to dying all day, and the day wasn't over. Jack Bennett's tank encountered panzers south of Courseulles, 3 of them. Panzer IVs, better armed, better armored than Jack's Churchill. In a straight fight, Jack would lose, but Jack wasn't going to fight straight. Driver reverse, into that alley Jack ordered. The tank backed into a narrow alley between stone buildings, barely wide enough. The Panzer followed, trying to get a clear shot, but in the narrow space it couldn't maneuver well. Jack waited until it was committed, then ordered, forward, ram speed. The Churchill lunged forward, 40 tons of steel accelerating. It crashed into the side of the Panzer. Not a killing blow, but enough to throw off the German crew, enough to give Jack's gunner a shot at close range. The Sherman gun fired, penetrated the Panzer's side armor. The German tank exploded. Men scrambled out. On fire. Jack felt sick again, but he couldn't stop. Two more panzers to deal with. The German counterattack failed, not because the Canadians destroyed all the panzers, they didn't, but because the Canadians wouldn't stay still, wouldn't form defensive lines that could be broken. They just kept moving, flowing around German armor like water around rocks. By noon, the German tanks were scattered, disorganized, taking casualties without achieving objectives. And Major Klaus Weber approached Canadian lines under a white flag, met with Frank Morrison, offered the surrender of 800 German soldiers, the first of many surrenders that day. By 1 o'clock, over 2,000 Germans had given up in the Juno sector. The Atlantic Wall had a 9-mile gap punched through it, but the success created problems nobody had anticipated. Canadian units were 9 miles inland, far beyond where logistics had planned for them to be. Ammunition was running low. Food was scarce. Medical supplies had to be rushed forward on improvised supply lines. And French civilians were being liberated weeks ahead of schedule. In towns like Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer and Bernier, French people emerged from hiding. 4 years under Nazi occupation. 4 years of waiting. And suddenly freedom came faster than anyone expected. Tommy Sullivan was walking through Bernier when a little girl ran up to him, maybe 10 years old. She had a flower in her hand. She gave it to Tommy and said something in French. Tommy didn't understand. Eddie Chen was nearby, translating for other units. He heard the girl and translated for Tommy. She says, "Thank you. Her father said you would come, but she didn't believe it would be so fast." Tommy knelt down to the girl's level. Through Eddie's translation, he said, "We promised we would come. We kept our promise." The girl smiled. Then she hugged Tommy. And Tommy Sullivan, 20-year-old machine gunner from Saskatchewan, who'd killed men that day and let one live who'd run through hell and somehow survived, found himself crying. Relief, exhaustion, joy, sorrow. Everything mixed together. On the USS Augusta, General William Foster called his staff together, spread maps across a table, pointed at the Canadian sector. "Gentlemen," Foster said, "what the Canadians accomplished today should have been impossible. Yet they did it, with lower casualties than predicted. I want a full tactical analysis, every detail, because we need to understand what they did right and what we did wrong," an officer asked. "Sir, should we modify our tactics?" Foster shook his head. "Not in the middle of a battle. Our men aren't trained for it. But after this, after we secure the beachhead, we're rewriting the manual." It was the beginning. The first acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the conventional wisdom was wrong. That innovation could come from unexpected places. That a Canadian general nobody had heard of might have discovered something that would change warfare forever. The sun was setting on the longest day. Canadian soldiers were 9 miles inland, digging foxholes, posting sentries, trying to process what they just survived. 4,500 casualties. Terrible. Devastating. But half of what had been predicted. Half of what Dieppe had cost. The aggressive tactics that everyone said would cause a bloodbath had actually saved lives. Tommy Sullivan sat against a stone wall, exhausted, traumatized, alive. He pulled out his brother Michael's photograph, stared at it in the fading light. "We did it, Mike," Tommy whispered. "We didn't stop. Just like you said, we kept moving, and we won." 6 o'clock in the evening, June 6, 1944. The sun was finally breaking through the clouds over Normandy. For the first time all day, you could see clearly across the landscape. Canadian soldiers looked back toward Juno Beach and saw something that seemed impossible. The ocean filled with ships as far as the eye could see, hundreds of landing craft moving back and forth like ants. The beach itself covered with vehicles, supplies, and troops, and stretching inland columns of Canadian soldiers and tanks 9 miles deep into France, deeper than any Allied force on D-Day. Tommy Sullivan sat against a stone wall in a French village called Bernier-sur-Mer. His hands were shaking. Not from cold, from adrenaline finally wearing off, from the realization that he was alive, that he'd survived. Around him, men were digging foxholes for the night, cleaning weapons, checking ammunition. The smell of smoke and cordite hung in the air, the sound of distant artillery. But here in this small village, there was almost quiet. Tommy pulled out his brother Michael's photograph, creased, stained with seawater and sweat. He stared at Michael's face, younger, smiling, before Dieppe, before the war stole that smile forever. "We did it, Mike," Tommy whispered. "We didn't stop. Just like you said, we kept moving." Sergeant Frank Morrison sat down beside him. Frank looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. Dirt covered his face, his engineer's uniform torn and bloodstained. He'd been blowing up German fortifications for 12 straight hours. His ears were still ringing from explosions. "You okay?" Sullivan Frank asked. Tommy didn't answer right away. He kept staring at Michael's photo. Then he said, "I let a German go today, back in Corsul, kid about my age. He dropped his rifle. I could have shot him, should have shot him, but I let him go." Frank was quiet for a moment. "You think that makes you weak?" "I don't know what it makes me," Tommy said. Michael would have wanted revenge. For Dieppe, for everything. But when I looked at that German kid, all I saw was fear. Same fear I feel. Frank put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "That makes you human, kid. Not weak. Human. Your brother would understand. He'd be proud you kept your promise. That you kept moving, that you survived." Tommy folded the photograph carefully. Put it back in his jacket pocket. "How many did we lose today?" Sarge Frank shook his head. "Don't know the final count yet. Thousands. But it could have been worse. Would have been worse if we'd done it the old way." A few hundred yards away, Corporal Jack Bennett was performing maintenance on his flamethrower tank. The Churchill Crocodile had survived the entire day. Miraculous considering how many German anti-tank guns had been firing. Jack's crew was exhausted. 4 men covered in soot and oil. They'd been inside that metal box for 14 hours, breathing diesel fumes and cordite, operating in heat that made them feel like they were being cooked alive. Another tank commander, a guy from Alberta named Davis, walked over to Jack. "Bennett," Davis said, "that charge through Corsuls, that was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen. You saved a lot of infantry lives." Jack didn't look up from the tank treads he was inspecting. "I was terrified every second. We all were. Don't make us heroes. We're just guys who didn't want to die." Davis nodded. "Fair enough. But you did it anyway. Terrified or not." Jack finally looked at him. His eyes were red. From smoke and exhaustion and something else. Something harder to name. "You know what the worst part is?" Jack said. "The flamethrower. Burning men alive. I can still hear them screaming. I'll always hear them screaming." Davis didn't have an answer for that. There was no answer. War makes you do terrible things. Makes you into someone you didn't know you could be. Makes you live with it forever. On the command ship USS Hillary, General James Thornton was receiving casualty reports. Eddie Chen, the radio operator, was compiling numbers from all the units, writing them on a chalkboard. The numbers were better than predicted. Much better. But they were still devastating. "Final count, Sir," Eddie said. "Approximately 4,500 Canadian casualties. Killed, wounded, and missing." Admiral Robert Harris stood beside Thornton. They both stared at the chalkboard in silence. 4,500 families destroyed. 4,500 men who wouldn't go home. The victory felt hollow suddenly. Heavy. Thornton's voice was barely a whisper. "We predicted 8,000 casualties. I cut that in half. But 4,500 men still died because of my plan." Harris turned to him. "Jim, those men didn't die because of your plan. They died because we're at war with Nazi Germany, and 9,500 men lived who shouldn't have. Your tactics saved lives." Thornton shook his head. "Tell that to the mothers who lost sons today. Tell them their boys died, but it could have been worse." Harris didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Victory always has a price, always leaves scars. Even when you do everything right, men still die. Eddie Chen was listening to this exchange. 22 years old. He'd spent the day coordinating radio traffic, relaying orders, marking positions on maps. He hadn't fired a weapon, hadn't killed anyone, but he'd heard the voices on the radio, the screaming, the calls for medics, the desperation. He felt guilty somehow, for being safe while others died, for surviving while better men didn't. The Atlantic Wall was broken, and intelligence reports confirmed it. A 9-mile gap punched through Hitler's impregnable fortress. German units retreating in chaos. The path to Paris theoretically open. It was a triumph, a historic achievement, the greatest single-day success of the Normandy invasion. But it didn't feel like triumph, not yet, not with 4,500 casualties. Not with the dead still lying on the beaches, not with the wounded screaming in field hospitals, not with letters that would need to be written to families, letters that started with, "We regret to inform you." Thornton walked to the railing of the command ship, looked out at the coast of France, smoke rising from a dozen points inland, the last light of day painting everything in shades of red and gold, beautiful in a terrible way. He thought about Tommy Sullivan, about Frank Morrison, about Jack Bennett and the thousands of others. He'd given them a plan, trained them, sent them into hell, and most of them had survived. But not all, never all. Night fell on Normandy, the longest day in history finally ending. Canadian soldiers dug in for the night, set up defensive perimeters, posted sentries. The exhaustion was overwhelming. Men fell asleep in foxholes with weapons in their hands. Some had nightmares immediately. Others were too tired even for dreams. Tommy Sullivan pulled out the letter he had written to his mother the night before. The letter that said, "If you are reading this, I didn't make it." He struck a match, watched the paper burn, watched the words turn to ash. He'd survived. He'd write a different letter tomorrow. One that said, "I'm alive, Ma. I kept Michael's promise. I'm alive." The weeks after D-Day were not easy. The beaches were secured, but France was still full of Germans. The fighting continued. Brutal. House to house in some places. Open field battles in others. The Canadians pushed toward a city called Caen, a major objective, heavily fortified. The Germans were defending it with everything they had. June turned to July. The initial triumph of D-Day gave way to the grinding reality of sustained combat. Men died every day. Not in the dramatic way of the beach assault, but in small firefights. Artillery barrages, sniper shots, the slow accumulation of casualties that marks any campaign. Tommy, Frank, and Jack were still alive, still fighting, still following Thornton's principles. Keep moving, maintain pressure, don't give the enemy time to reorganize. It worked more often than not, but not always. Sometimes the aggressive tactics led to ambushes, to units getting caught in kill zones, to casualties that could have been avoided with more caution. War is never clean, never follows theory perfectly. Thornton's methods were better than the old way, saved lives overall, but they couldn't save everyone, couldn't prevent every death, and that weighed on Thornton every single day. July 8th, 1944, the Battle of Caen, 1 month and 2 days after D-Day. The Canadians were fighting to capture the city. The Germans were fighting to hold it. The streets were a maze of rubble and death, every building a potential ambush, every corner a killing ground. General James Thornton was at a forward command post. Unusual for a major general, most commanders stayed well behind the front lines. Directed operations from safety, but Thornton never liked commanding from the rear. He wanted to be close to his men, to see what they were seeing, to understand the reality of what he was asking them to do. At 2:15 in the afternoon, German artillery began a bombardment. Heavy guns, 155mm shells. They'd spotted the command post somehow, knew it was a valuable target. The shells came screaming in, explosions that shook the earth, threw up clouds of dirt and debris. Thornton was standing outside talking to a colonel about the next phase of the attack. The shell landed 20 feet away. The explosion was enormous. Shrapnel flew in every direction, hot metal fragments moving faster than sound. Several pieces tore through Thornton's body, his leg, his back. He went down hard. Medics rushed to him. Thornton was conscious, in agony but conscious, blood soaking through his uniform. His leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his back torn open. The medics worked frantically. Pressure bandages, morphine, trying to stabilize him for evacuation. "Don't stop the attack," Thornton gasped, his voice barely audible. "Keep moving, keep the pressure on." Those were his last words in combat. They loaded him onto a stretcher, carried him to an ambulance, then to a field hospital, then to a hospital ship, then to England. The entire time Thornton drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he kept asking about his men, about the battle, about whether they'd taken Caen. Nobody told him the truth, that his war was over, that he'd never command troops in combat again. The surgeries took hours, multiple operations to remove shrapnel, to repair damaged tissue, to save his leg. They managed to save it, but the damage was permanent. Thornton would walk with a cane for the rest of his life, would live with chronic pain, would wake up some mornings and feel the ghost of that explosion all over again. His wife Margaret came to England as soon as she could, sat beside his hospital bed for weeks, watched him struggle with the reality of his situation. At 42 years old, James Thornton's combat career had ended at the moment of his greatest triumph. The irony was not lost on him, Jim Margaret said one afternoon. At least you're alive. Do you know how many women would trade places with me right now? How many wives are widows because of this war? Thornton stared at the ceiling. I should be with them, with my men. They need me. They need you alive, Margaret said. They need to know that what you taught them works, that it saves lives. You've already proven that. But Thornton felt useless. A general without an army, a commander without a command. He'd spent 2 years developing a new way to fight, training men, leading them. And now, 1 month after proving it worked, he was done, finished, relegated to hospitals and paperwork and recovery that would take months. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division continued fighting without him, pushed through France, into Belgium, into the Netherlands. They used Thornton's tactics, maintained aggressive momentum, kept the Germans off balance, and they performed consistently well. Better than many other units, because Thornton had trained them, had instilled in them a philosophy, a way of thinking about combat. Tommy Sullivan fought all the way to Germany, survived firefights in French towns, artillery barrages in Belgian fields, house to house fighting in Dutch cities. He was 23 when the war in Europe ended. May 8, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. Tommy stood in a German town square with his unit. Men were cheering, crying, hugging each other. The war was over. They'd survived. Tommy's first thought was of Michael. I wish you could see this, Mike. We won. We actually won. Frank Morrison also survived the war, made it home to Ontario, went back to teaching math at the same high school he had left in 1941. He never talked about the war to his students, never mentioned Dieppe or Juno Beach or the German bunkers he'd blown up. But he taught math differently than before. He emphasized creative problem solving, unconventional approaches, thinking outside the textbook. One day a student asked, Mr. Morrison, why do you always want us to question the standard method? Frank looked at the student, smiled slightly, because sometimes the standard method will get you killed. Sometimes you need to find a better way. The student didn't understand, but Frank did. He understood that the greatest lesson of his war years wasn't about explosives or combat engineering. It was about questioning authority, about trusting your own analysis even when everyone says you're wrong, about innovation saving lives. Jack Bennett went back to British Columbia, opened a garage, worked on cars instead of tanks, married a local girl, had 3 children, built a normal life. But he couldn't escape the war, couldn't forget. The smell of diesel fuel made him nauseous, reminded him of burning tanks, of German soldiers screaming as they burned. He had nightmares sometimes. Woke up in a cold sweat, smelling cordite that wasn't there. His wife learned not to ask about the war, learned to recognize the signs when he was having a bad day, when the memories were too close, when he needed to be alone. There was a photograph on the wall of his garage. Jack and his tank crew at Juno Beach. 5 young men who'd done something impossible. 4 of them had survived the war. The 5th, the loader, had died in Belgium in October 1944. Jack looked at that photo every day. Remembered. Eddie Chen faced a different kind of battle when he came home. He'd served his country, risked his life, helped liberate France. But he was still Chinese Canadian, still faced discrimination. He couldn't get certain jobs despite his military service, couldn't buy a house in certain neighborhoods. The racism was quieter than the war, more subtle, but just as real. Eddie eventually became a translator for the Canadian government, used his language skills in diplomacy and trade. He never complained about the discrimination, just worked harder, proved himself over and over, and slowly things improved, not quickly, not easily, but they improved. Meanwhile, James Thornton was given desk jobs in Ottawa, administrative positions. He attended ceremonies, cut ribbons, gave speeches to military academies. But he wasn't leading men anymore. wasn't making tactical decisions, wasn't doing what he was best at, and it ate at him. Margaret would find him staring out the window sometimes, lost in thought. Jim, she'd say, you changed warfare. You saved thousands of lives. That's enough, is it? Thornton would reply, because nobody knows my name. The tactics spread, but I'm forgotten, and more men are dying in Korea using the old methods. It was true, the Korean War had started in 1950. American forces were fighting there, and initially they'd reverted to pre-D-Day tactics, slow amphibious assaults, cautious advancement. The casualty rates were terrible. It took months before someone remembered Juno Beach, remembered the Canadian success, remembered that speed through the danger zone saves lives. By 1952, American military academies were teaching what they called momentum doctrine. Fort Benning started including it in amphibious warfare courses. Instructors taught about continuous assault tactics, about 30-second spacing, about maintaining forward pressure. But they rarely mentioned James Thornton, rarely credited the man who'd developed it. Thornton attended one of these lectures in 1952, sat in the back row, anonymous, just another aging officer. The young instructor at the front of the room explained momentum doctrine, talked about its effectiveness, its origins in the Normandy invasion, but never mentioned Thornton's name. After the lecture, Thornton quietly left. Margaret asked him later, "Does it bother you that he didn't mention you?" Thornton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The men who use those tactics, the men who lived because of them, they know that's enough." But it wasn't really enough. You could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at old photographs, the way he read casualty reports from Korea. He'd discovered something important, proven it worked, saved thousands of lives, and history was forgetting him. 1954, Ottawa Hospital. James Thornton was 52 years old. The same age his men had been on D-Day was now the age at which he died. The wounds from Caen had never fully healed. Infections kept recurring, his body slowly failing. Doctors did what they could, but some damage can't be repaired. Margaret sat beside his bed, held his hand. Thornton's breathing was shallow, labored. He knew he was dying, could feel it, had felt it for days. "Did we save lives?" Thornton whispered, his voice barely audible. Margaret squeezed his hand, tears running down her face. "You saved thousands, Jim. Thousands of men went home to their families because of you." Thornton smiled faintly. "Good, that's good." Those were his last words. He died peacefully that afternoon. No drama, no grand scene. Just a general dying in a hospital bed knowing he'd made a difference, even if the world had forgotten. The funeral was small, military honors. An honor guard from the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, 6 men in uniform carrying Thornton's casket. Among them was Tommy Sullivan, now 32 years old, married, working his family farm in Saskatchewan. He'd taken a week off to come to Ottawa, to pay respects to the general who'd saved his life. Frank Morrison was there. Jack Bennett flew in from British Columbia. Eddie Chen came from Vancouver. 4 men who'd survived Juno Beach, who'd kept moving when everything told them to stop, who owed their lives to the man in the casket. As they carried Thornton to his grave, Tommy remembered June 6, 1944, remembered running up Juno Beach with a machine gun, remembered the fear and the chaos and the impossible speed of it all, remembered not stopping. He thought about Michael, about the promise he'd kept, about how Thornton had given him the chance to honor his brother. Before they lowered the casket, Tommy placed something on top of it, Michael's photograph, the one he'd carried through the entire war, creased and stained, but still intact. He whispered, "Thank you, sir. You gave me the chance to keep my promise." The 4 men stood at the grave as they lowered Thornton into the ground. None of them spoke. What was there to say? The general who'd changed warfare was being buried with minimal fanfare. No politicians, no press, just a handful of veterans who knew what he'd done, who understood what he'd meant. Today, 80 years after D-Day, if you visit the Juno Beach Center in France, you'll find a museum dedicated to Canadian achievement. Names engraved on walls. Thousands of names. Michael Sullivan is there. And 4,499 others who died on June 6, 1944. There's one small plaque mentioning Major General James Thornton. Most visitors walk past it. Don't stop to read. don't recognize the name, but that plaque represents something important. Every military academy in the world teaches the tactics Thornton developed. They don't always call it by his name. Sometimes it's momentum doctrine, sometimes continuous assault tactics, sometimes just modern amphibious warfare. But the principles are his. Speed through the danger zone, maintain pressure, don't let the enemy reorganize. The lesson of Juno Beach extends beyond military tactics. It's about questioning conventional wisdom, about trusting innovation even when it seems crazy, about how the people most likely to change the world that are often the ones nobody expects. The underdogs, the underestimated, the ones with something to prove. The Canadians at Juno Beach were dismissed as colonial troops, less experienced than Americans and British, not ready for the hardest beach. But they penetrated deeper than any Allied force on D-Day. They had lower casualties than predicted. They broke through Hitler's Atlantic Wall in hours because they refused to accept that the old way was the only way. That's a lesson America should remember. This country was built by people who questioned authority, who tried new approaches, who refused to be told something couldn't be done. The founders who declared independence from the most powerful empire on earth. The pioneers who crossed a continent everyone said was uncrossable. The innovators who created technologies everyone said were impossible. Sometimes the fastest way through hell is straight through, not around it, not slowly, but charging forward with courage and conviction. That's what the Canadians proved on June 6, 1944. That's what James Thornton understood when everyone else didn't. That's what Tommy Sullivan learned from his brother's dying words. Keep moving, don't stop. Trust your instincts when the manual says otherwise. Question the conventional wisdom. Find a better way. Save lives. Those lessons matter today as much as they did 80 years ago. Maybe more. Because we live in a world that often values caution over courage. That follows procedures even when they don't work. That dismisses innovation from unexpected sources. If you learn something from this story, share it. Share it with your children, your grandchildren. The younger generation needs to hear these stories, needs to know that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That innovation comes from unexpected places. That sometimes the biggest changes come from the people nobody expected to change anything. The men who stormed Juno Beach are mostly gone now. Tommy Sullivan died in 1998, Frank Morrison in 2003, Jack Bennett in 2001, Eddie Chen in 2006. The generation that saved the world is fading. But their lessons remain. Their courage remains. Their proof that innovation defeats impossible odds remains. The waves still crash on Juno Beach. The sand is peaceful now. But if you listen carefully, if you remember, you can almost hear 14,000 men running forward. Not stopping, not pausing, just moving toward freedom. Just proving that sometimes having something to prove is the greatest advantage of all. Remember them, honor them, and carry forward their lesson. That courage combined with innovation defeats obstacles that seem impossible. That the people everyone underestimates are often the ones who change everything. That sometimes the manual is wrong and the maverick is right. That's the day Canada taught America how to win wars. And that's a lesson worth remembering forever.